Good evening, everyone. Tonight we shall explore a peculiar and often forgotten chapter of history, the resurgence of an ancient plague, the third great plague outbreak. Forget images of doctors in bird-minus faced masks and medieval castles. This time you are neither knight nor peasant, but find yourself in late 9th century Hong Kong or early 20th century San Francisco, facing an invisible enemy beyond the comprehension of science at the time. A plague spreading at unprecedented speed. Before we relax, if you enjoy my work, please like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what time it is locally right now. I love seeing viewers from all corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for some gentle background noise. Let us begin tonight's journey. Long before the Western world knew disaster was coming, deep in the mountains of Yunnan, China, the plague was no stranger. It was no new phenomenon, but an ancient shadow lurking in the highlands along the frontier. China, Myanmar, Lam and Vietnam's remote plateau borderlands, imagined towering peaks, deep river valleys and dense forests intertwined. Thin air, all things moving to their own rhythm, cut off from the world. In this fertile ground where life converges, Yersinia pestis had long made its home. It pairs its wild rodents, particularly the Himalayan marmot. This seemingly robust, seemingly harmless creature carries the deadly pathogen. These marmots and local rodents, such as moles, often harbor the plague without immediate fatality. Fleas on their fur thus become infected, and these plague-scurrying fleas acquire a terrifying lethality. Yunan's ecological chain quietly propels this ancient threat towards humanity. The region's rich deposits of tin, silver, lead and other minerals draw miners from across China seeking fortune. These men, pursuing livelihoods, venture deep into the mountains, dwell in makeshift dwellings carved from the harsh terrain, to labor for survival. Their camps are crude and filthy. Crucially, they lived in close proximity to local animals, including rodents carrying the plague. Imagine tents or mud huts on hillsides, surrounded by waste and foraging rats. This was a world where humans and animals cohabited. The miners hunted and stripped marmot pelts, unaware that every touch, every pelt, every piece of meat could be deadly. Tiny, deadly fleas found a new home in the miners' camps. They leapt from dying marmots onto rodents living near humans, then onto the miners themselves. But the victims were limited to miners. Yunnan was a hub on the ancient trade routes connecting China to Southeast Asia and India, saw caravans traversing mountain passes and perilous paths to transport goods like tea, opium, silk and other goods. These merchants, accompanied by assistants and livestock, rested in villages and market towns. Each stopover was not merely a place for trading goods, but also a breeding ground for disease transmission. Rats, humans, long-time companions of mankind, crawling into sacks, hiding in carriages, sneaking into ship holds. They carried not only bacteria, but also infected fleas. Thus a disease once confined to remote regions gradually forged new pathways to the wider world. Over centuries, the plague simmered persistently in Yunnan, occasionally erupting in mass fatalities dubbed the mysterious fever or local epidemics, its true origins forever unknown. Yet with the expansion of mining and trade in the late 19th century, pressure steadily mounted. The pathogens lurking in their natural breeding grounds finally found their moment to march for. The pent-up fury of Yunnan was about to erupt. This migration of pathogens from Yunnan to the coast was a silent narrative woven by trade and human movement. The plague set out from its birthplace on the Yunnan Plateau and spread along China's rivers and overland routes. Imagine tributaries like the Red River flowing into the Pearl River system. These waterways served as conduits for pathogens. Bamboo rafts laden with cargo and passengers drifted downstream, transporting not only rice and tea, but also rodents. Consider the Red River and other tributaries feeding into the Pearl River system. They became unrecognized pathways for disease. Small bamboo rafts, heavy with goods and people, drifted downstream, carrying not only rice and tea, but also harboring rats concealed in holds and fleas clinging to fur. These vessels became breeding grounds for disease transmission. Whenever they moored at ports or riverside villages for trade or rest, not only did humans disembark, but disease miners carrying rats also leapt ashore, mingling with local wildlife. Thus miners choked cattle tracks and livestock passages, likewise facilitated bacterial spread, carriers and merchants trekking for weeks between inland cities, lodged in rudimentary inns overrun by rodents. Hungry fleas proved indiscriminate, leaping from wild rats to domestic ones, then onto humans, or transmitting in reverse, forming an unbroken chain of disease. This constituted a covert network, stretching from mountains to sea. Bacteria gradually adapted to crowded cities, with bustling Guangzhou at its hub. Today's Guangzhou, this colossal metropolis stands as South China's thriving capital, by busy river ports, labyrinthine alleys, crowded markets and cramped dwellings, from a breeding ground for plague. Once the disease took root in Guangzhou, its eventual spread to Hong Kong seemed inevitable. The two cities stood in close proximity. Steamers and sailing vessels traversed the waters ceaselessly. The voyage took but a few hours. Hong Kong, then a British colony, had become the Pearl of the Orient, a global trade hub. Its deep Minas-water harbour ranked among the world's busiest ports, drawing vessels from the British Empire and across the globe, attracting merchants from mainland China and worldwide. Yet this convergence also rendered it a pressure cooker for disease. The city itself was rife with contradictions. Colonial European architecture and modern port facilities formed a jewel, while Chinatown presented a starkly different picture. Narrow streets, overcrowded dwellings with appalling sanitation, rat infestations. Within the Chinese Quarter, residents lived in densely packed high-minus rises, where sunlight scarcely reached the lower floors. Public corridors were filthy. Rodents were aged and bred here, enjoying paradise. Every vessel arriving in Hong Kong carried potential disease. Each wharf served as a transit point. Plague needed not travel far. It silently shifted from hold to hold, transmitted by fleas, shuttling between ports, until it launched from Hong Kong, the perfect global lawn pact. It was only a matter of time before Pearl Harbor was infected. Spring 1890 descended upon Hong Kong. The air was stiflingly humid and oppressive. Yet for the inhabitants of this British colony, the true burden lay not in the weather, but in a more insidious, deadly threat. Distant rumors from Guangzhou, a series of fatal cases of high fever, once scornfully dismissed by the colonizers as a Chinese problem, now erupted into a terrifying roar. The blow of Hong Kong's plague outbreak, like a dark warning bell, revealed that modern architecture nor technology could withstand the ancient, invisible enemy. The first clear signs appeared in the most densely populated Chinese settlements, particularly on Taiping Shannon in Shenzhen. Houses stacked like jungle thickets, alleyways dark and damp as labyrinths, sanitary conditions abysmal. Imagine those poorly ventilated dwellings, open sewers flowing freely through the streets, countless rats roaming freely between homes and markets. Early May, British doctors, initially skeptical, began discerning a clear pattern in the case's high fever, extreme debility. Most distinct and terrifying were the abscesses, swollen lymph nodes, often as large as eggs, appearing in the groin, underarms or neck. These blackened, festering boils signaled imminent death, often claiming lives within mere days. The epidemic's impact on the city was swift and devastating. Tanhua Hospital, excruciatingly painful lymph node swellings, often as large as eggs, appearing in the groin, underarms or neck. These blackened, ulcerated abscesses signaled impending death. Patients often succumbed within days. The epidemic's impact on the city was swift and devastating. Dongzhou Hospital, the primary medical center for the Chinese community, became overwhelmed within days. Wards were filled with the dying. Traditional Chinese medicine and its ancient formulas proved powerless against this disease. A few Western physicians were equally at a loss. Mortality rates remained alarmingly high. Estimates suggest over 90% of confirmed cases proved fatal. Chaos engulfed the Chinese enclaves. Panic spread. To evade the plague or the colonial authorities' stringent quarantine orders, residents fled their homes en masse. Bodies and the sick were abandoned in the streets. Once minus thriving thoroughfares fell abruptly silent. Only the voices of the corpse minus carriers echoed through the streets. It is believed that at the peak of the epidemic, thousands fled by sea to Guangzhou or escaped by land, unwittingly spreading the plague across the land. The British colonial authorities' response was riddled with chaos, fear and deepening despair. Initially, they attempted to deny the scale of the outbreak, but the truth could not be evaded. Entire districts were designated quarantine zones, residents forcibly relocated, houses fumigated with quicklime, chlorine gas, even explosives, in an attempt to eradicate fleas. These brutal and culturally insensitive measures provoked fierce resistance among the Chinese community, who viewed Western medicine and its methods as either insulting or madness. Many went into hiding, refused treatment or fled, merely to avoid being sent to the plague hospitals, which soon gained notoriety as places from which no one was said to survive amidst this chaos and grief. Scientific aid arrived quietly, though initially not regarded as a savior. The British and French governments dispatched their foremost bacteriologist, Alexander Yersin, a young Swiss-French physician trained under Pasteur, and Shibasaburo Kitsutaso, Japan's eminent bacteriologist mentored by Robert Koch. Both undertook research in arduous conditions and at times competed with each other, while bearing the weighty responsibility of identifying the causative pathogen. Yersin worked in a makeshift laboratory within a stable, while Kitsutaso confronted the pathogen in a more formal laboratory. By late July 1894, both claimed to have discovered the causative agent, yet Yersin, having first confronted the pathogen in a formal laboratory and endured weeks of intensive research, ultimately gained broader and more enduring recognition. His findings clearly elucidated the bacterium's pathogenic mechanism through direct confrontation with the disease in a more formal laboratory setting. After weeks of intensive research, by late July 1894, both claimed to have identified the causative agent, yet Yersin gained broader and more enduring recognition for being the first to clearly publish findings revealing bacterial pathogenesis and lymph node swelling. This pivotal moment in medical history marked the dawn of modern scientific understanding of plague. Yet the discovery of the bacterium did not end the nightmare. Despite advances in Western medicine, no effective treatment, no vaccine remained. The sole countermeasures were maintaining cleanliness, enforcing quarantine and exterminating rats, measures that proved difficult to implement and sparked intense social conflict. Hong Kong became the battleground for this unequal struggle. The pearl of the Orient, the pride of the empire, faded in the shadow of death. Despite science and human pride, we once again faced an ancient and vicious foe, awakening from its slumber in distant mountains, traveling thousands of miles to reclaim its power. Now the plague would not halt at a single city. That fateful summer of 1894, Victoria City, Hong Kong, was shrouded in sweltering heat and chaos. Corpses piled like mountains. Fear spread through every alley. The scientific giants arrived with their teams and academic prestige, bearing the arduous mission to name the invisible killer, shouldering the grave task to name this invisible killer. The desperate British colony sought aid from the world's foremost scientific institutions. Thus, in the land ravaged by disease and panic, a silent yet fierce contest began, aiming to unravel the plague's mystery. On one side stood Shibasuburo Kitsutasu, this eminent Japanese bacteriologist, once a prized pupil of Robert Koch, led Japan's advanced medical science. He led an extensive team into action. His approach was meticulous, nearly military in its discipline, and his pursuit of the highest standards of the time secured him special access to the city's hospitals and mortuaries. This privilege seemed to give him an early advantage in this dark quest. On the other side, Alexander Yersin arrived discreetly, this Franco-Swiss physician and bacteriologist, renowned for his adventurous spirit. Having gained renown at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, he belonged to a different breed, a scientific explorer, perhaps more inclined towards direct observation and keen intuition than academic protocol. Unlike Kitazae, Yersin secured no comparable support. He labored in a makeshift hut laboratory under dire conditions, remote from hospitals, and with limited sampling personnel. He often had to persuade the populace, or conduct clandestine autopsies near makeshift burial grounds, the air thick with formaldehyde and decay, flies buzzing incessantly. A shack serving as laboratory, remote from hospitals and understaffed. When collecting samples, he frequently had to persuade the populace, or performed secret autopsies near temporary graves. The air thick with formaldehyde and decay. The buzzing of flies was the only background sound. Competition, though unspoken, was ever present, under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, braving the damp, stifling heat. They worked with rapt attention in the makeshift laboratory. After hours of unrelenting study, they extracted samples from swollen, painful abscesses, drained blood from the organs of the deceased. Under the microscope, they constantly adjusted the focus, searching for the minute culprit. They cultured strains on agar plates. Day after day, they watched the bacterial colonies in this miniature garden. Life and death danced in miniature. Yoshichika Kitase, drawing on his experience and resources, announced his findings just days after arriving. He claimed to have isolated bacilli. The first detailed and confident report seemed to settle the matter. Yet in Yersin's makeshift laboratory, truth held a different tale. Yersin, who began dissections mere hours after arrival, similarly discovered bacilli-like organism. But his isolation process proved purer, more consistent. Subsequent descriptions of microbial morphology were also more precise. The key to success may have lain in methodology. Kitazae sampled from patient blood, while Yersin focused on abscess tissue, those abnormally swollen lymph nodes at the disease's epicenter, where pathogens clustered most densely and most purely. July 1894. After nearly 10 days of exhausting, all-night work, Yersin submitted his report to the French Academy of Sciences in Paris. He described a short rod-shaped bacterium with darkly stained ends and no motility, naming it Yersinia pestis. He successfully inoculated this bacillus into experimental animals, rabbits, guinea pigs, mice, which developed identical symptoms to humans before dying, and from whose tissues the same bacillus was isolated, providing definitive proof. Koch's postulates were validated at the scene of the disaster. Nishizawa also published research findings. Though his descriptions contained flaws, the discovered bacilli appeared to be mixed cultures, or exhibited characteristics not fully consistent with later perspectives. Over time, the global scientific community ultimately recognized Yersin's discovery. The bacillus causing bubonic plague was named with historical justice Yersinia pestis. Discovering this bacillus constituted a monumental scientific achievement, a beacon illuminating the unknown darkness. It not only named the hidden adversary, but also inaugurated a new chapter in plague research. The discovery of Yersinia pestis was a monumental scientific achievement. Like a beacon in the darkness, it not only identified the concealed foe, but also unlocked the door to understanding the transmission mechanisms of plague, the door to diagnostic methods and even prevention strategies. Yet identifying the pathogen was merely the first step. The pressing question that followed was, how did this cunning, microscopic foe traverse oceans and continents with such terrifying efficiency? Thus entered the death smugglers. They were neither sailors nor merchants. Rather, they were furry little creatures. Rats, and upon them rode tiny, yet deadly passengers, fleas. Though it would take years to fully grasp this crucial insight, historical reflection explains why the third plague pandemic achieved truly global proportion. The black rat, Rattus rattus, though not a majestic creature, its adaptability and close association with human settlements made it the perfect vessel for the plague. It favored dwelling in human refuse and stored grain, and was particularly adept at making its home in the dark, damp corners of ship hold. At this point, the true logistical star of this plague made its entrance: the steamship. This invention of the Industrial Revolution, intended to shorten distances and accelerate global trade, but ironically became the ideal vessel for death's transmission. Traditional sailing ships moved slowly, taking months to cross the Atlantic, where infected rats often perished before arrival, along with the fleas upon them, breaking the chain of disease transmission. Yet steamships reduced journeys to weeks or even days, altering everything. Rats survived. The fleas, clinging to their starving, thirsty intestines, survived too. Imagine the holds of these iron and steam behemoths. Labyrinthine spaces crammed with rice from China and Asia's plague zones, tea chests, bales of cotton, bundles of silk and other cargoes, both a feast for rats, and perfect hiding places. They multiplied among the cargo, fed and crucially, died when rats became infected with Yersinia pestis, and fleas from infected rats perished in the ship's dark holds. They lost their hosts in short new blood sources, and who awaited at the destination port to unload the precious cargo, who was the most readily available host: humans. This mechanism is simple. Fleas, having lost their host, seek fresh blood at the destination port, awaiting unloading. Who was most within reach? Humans. This system is both simple and brutal. Rat colonies became infected in Asian ports. Diseased rats, drawn by food and shelter, boarded steamships. The voyage's speed was unprecedented. Dead rats littered the hold. Hungry fleas abandoned the cold carcasses in search of fresh hosts. Upon arrival at the destination port, they leapt from the dead rats onto dock workers or any unfortunate soul nearby. After a few bites, Yersinia pestis took root within the human body. This deadly bacterium gained a new foothold in the New World. If port conditions were favorable, the plague would spread to the local rat population, initiating a fresh cycle, sparking a new wave of plague. The bacillus thus established a foothold in the New World, where conditions permitted. The plague would spread from ports to local rodent populations, commencing a renewed cycle and epidemic surge. At that time, no stringent regulations governed ship fumigation or rodent control globally. Understanding of flea-borne plague as a zoonotic disease remained rudimentary. Ships laden with precious yet deadly cargo traversed global trade routes unimpeded, connecting the world in unprecedented ways. From Hong Kong, the first major outbreaks known outside China, the epidemic swiftly spread to other vital Asian trade hubs: Singapore, Calcutta, especially the bustling city of Bombay, Asia's commercial center. Singapore, Calcutta, and especially the bustling city of Bombay became the next links in this global chain of plague. The world was about to confront a terrifying new reality, and this awakening proved exceptionally brutal. Before the third plague pandemic reached the shores of the Americas, it had already sown chaos and death across vast continents, etching deep scars into humanity's collective memory and fundamentally reshaping public health policies worldwide. The most severely afflicted region was undoubtedly British India: overcrowded cities, appalling sanitary conditions, and deep historical trade ties with China. made the Indian subcontinent a breeding ground for the plague. In 1896, the plague reached India, the British Empire's commercial jewel. Initial sporadic cases rapidly escalated into a torrent of death. The British colonial authorities' response was, as usual, stringent yet often ineffective and profoundly unpopular. Strict quarantine, lockdown of entire districts, fumigation. Initial sporadic cases rapidly escalated into a torrent of death. The British colonial authorities' response appeared inevitable at the time, involving a series of stringent, yet often ineffective and profoundly unpopular measures enforcing strict quarantine, lockdown of entire districts, fumigation of private dwellings. Most suffocating of all was the medical screening of travelers. These measures were perceived by locals as intolerable infringements upon their livelihoods and faith, often provoking resistance, riots and profound anger. Soldiers enforcing the policies sometimes resorted to force, which only exacerbated the conflict. The logistical challenges were immense. Faced with a plague rapidly spreading through a city of millions, how could quarantine measures possibly succeed? Quarantine hospitals and field hospitals were established. The patient numbers still vastly exceeded the capacity of medical resources. Deaths rose from thousands to tens of thousands. People fled by en masse, unwittingly spreading the plague to inland cities and other ports. Calcutta, another commercial giant, then capital of British India, could not escape the same fate. The scenes were identical: streets deserted, piles of corpses, only the wails of mourners. The entire subcontinent suffered its heaviest casualties during this third plague wave, with millions more lives lost over the following decades. Yet the epidemic did not remain confined to India. The very steamers that had carried the disease to Bombay and Calcutta now sailed laden with cargo and perhaps newly infected rat colonies to distant shores. When the plague emerged unexpectedly in foreign ports, panic began to spread across the globe. For instance, in 1900 the plague appeared in Sydney, after a merchant ship from the east docked. Cases soon emerged among dock workers and in the port area. Upon receiving the Asian plague alert, Australian authorities immediately implemented quarantine and rat extermination measures, established sanitary isolation zones, fumigated and disinfected ship holds and warehouses, and launched large minor-scale but minor-sketching operations. Cases subsequently appeared among dock workers and in the port area. Upon receiving the Asian plague alert, Australian authorities swiftly implemented isolation measures and launched rat extermination campaign, established sanitary quarantine zones, fumigated and disinfected ship holds and warehouses, simultaneously initiated large minor-scale rat extermination operations. Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide subsequently experienced outbreaks, exposing the vulnerability of these emerging Pacific ports. Africa was likewise not spared. The plague reached South Africa's Durban, Cape Town and other port cities, via maritime routes linking Asia and Europe. Populations residing in overcrowded conditions with limited medical resources were particularly at risk. The South African outbreak reaffirmed the plague's transatlantic spread to South America. The epidemic similarly invaded ports such as Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and Buenos Aires in Argentina. Steamships unloaded not only cargo, but also disease miners carrying stowaways. Rio de Janeiro's first recorded case occurred in the early 20th century, triggering widespread panic and prompting drastic measures including neighborhood-wide fumigation and rat extermination campaigns. Argentina also experienced outbreaks as the plague took root in multiple South American cities, demonstrating the efficient operation of global trade networks as vectors for pandemics. What was once a vast and seemingly fragmented world was now bound together by the invisible threads of commerce and the tragic bonds of disease, tightly intertwined. Governments were compelled to implement previously unimaginable public health policies. The rudiments of an international quarantine system emerged. Ship fumigation protocols were introduced. As awareness grew that plagues erupting in distant ports could reach domestic cities within weeks, global panic ensued. An unprecedented sense of vulnerability took hold. The plague had evolved into a global threat. Like a shadow, it hung over every port, every coastal city, as the Old World and other continents struggled against this wave of death. The flood of plague approached the shores of the Americas. The shores. San Francisco was unaware, yet it would soon become the next victim. Spring 1900. The San Francisco Bay Area teemed with life. This thriving jewel along the Pacific coast stood as a monument to the spirit of the gold rush and bore the hopes of a new century. Here, dreams and ambition intertwined. In a world that passed through its gates, and sometimes the world carried far more than ships could hold. From Hong Kong, Yokohama and Manila, steamships arrived laden with silk, spices and exotic treasures, yet also silently transported invisible stowaways. The war frats and their fleas, bearers of ancient plagues. This impending tragedy was not heralded by trumpets, but on 6 March 1900, a body was discovered in a modest hotel at the heart of Chinatown's bustling center. Within the Globe Hotel, tucked away in a labyrinthine corner of Chinatown, the body of Huang Zuoqing, a man in his 40s, was found, initially deemed a natural death, a common outcome in the bustling, nameless lives of immigrants. Yet Joseph Kim Yang, senior surgeon at the U.S. Naval Hospital, was closely monitoring epidemic reports from Asian Honolulu when he noticed the peculiar hue of the deceased's swollen lymph nodes. A chill ran through him. This unusual state of death gripped his heart. Kim Yang was renowned as a stubborn scientist. His reputation for bluntness often preceded him. He acted with both caution and decisiveness, a balance dictated by the situation and demanded by his experience. The lesions on the swollen lymph nodes unsettled him. Their hue was all too familiar, disturbingly so. This was no ordinary death. Jimple Y, the famously forthright, stubborn scientist, proceeded with both prudence, yet driven by the urgency born of experience. With the coroner's permission, he commenced the autopsy. The results confirmed his deepest fears, the very fears that had kept health authorities on tenterhooks for months. The wave of the Black Death was approaching the Golden Gate. Under forensic license, he performed the post-mortem. What he saw and heard confirmed his deepest fears. It was precisely this dread that had kept health authorities on tenterhooks for months. They knew full well the wave of the Black Death was closing in on the Golden Gate Strait. Tissue samples, particularly lymph nodes swollen to the size of eggs, were dispatched to laboratories. Under the microscope, Yersinia pestis became unmistakably visible. These microscopic harbingers of death confirmed the brutal truth: bubonic plague had reached San Francisco. Though initially confined to strict medical and governmental circles, this shattering news shook the very foundations of this young, prosperous city, a metropolis that prided itself as America's pinnacle of progress and modernity. Victorian mansions stood atop steep slopes. Clanging cable cars traversed the hills. The docks bustled with activity. Theatres pulsed with life. That such a primal plague, a scourge from Europe's darkest history, should lurk here was almost inconceivable, almost a personal affront. The distant spectre of medieval legend, the Black Death, was suddenly no longer myth, but a microscopic reality. An unwelcome visitor had crossed the ocean, appears in this city that refuses to believe. The discovery of Huang Zuoqing's body is not merely the finding of a corpse, but the turning point where an era of false security crumbles. This city is forced to confront an enemy as old as civilization itself, though cloaked in 20th-century garb. If exposing the plague was a blow, Then the reaction of California's political and business leaders amounts to a theatrical denial, a veritable farce. Far from mobilizing essential resources to assist strike Xinjiang, California's elite chose a path best summarized as out of sight, out of mind. Governor Henry Gage, a businessman's instincts far outweighed those of a public health advocate, becoming the chief architect of this silent conspiracy. Railroad magnates, shipping tycoons and landowners adhered to a logic as simple as it was flawed. Plague meant quarantine. Quarantine meant trade disruption. Economic paralysis would trigger mass panic, ultimately shattering California's golden image. This paradise Minos-like haven would inevitably collapse. The political campaign, Minos-like efficiency, displayed when denial machinery was activated was staggering. Gene Neon, who dared to speak plainly about the plague, swiftly became a target for malicious smear campaigns, branded an alarmist incompetent. His advanced laboratory methods were publicly ridiculed and questioned. Local newspapers, swayed by commercial and political interests, published editorials, either downplaying the threat or outright denying the epidemic. Some headlines even declared the plague is a federal government lie or madness, fabricated by Drive, Jin-Oi to secure funding. Government-controlled media became tools of misinformation, shielding prosperity from scrutiny. Yet the price of truth was disregarded. Gage and his allies showed no mercy. They pressured the Naval Hospital Administration to remove Kim Young, cut funding for plague research. More shockingly, they manipulated the State Board of Health, meant to safeguard public health. Board members were replaced with more compliant puppets. These individuals willingly endorsed the official narrative of plague-free California. When independent physicians who witnessed the evidence firsthand attempted to speak out, they were silenced under threat of license revocation or career ruin. California's message could not be clearer. Money trumps epidemiology. Its deliberate blindness even prompted Gage to strike a deal with neighboring states. His pledge that the plague does not exist was of course a premise built upon lies. Neighboring states lifted quarantine restrictions on trains departing California. While this strategy may have temporarily saved some businesses, it fostered an illusion of safety, allowing pathogens to silently infiltrate and spread across cities and wider regions. This was a reckless gamble, a poker game where thousands of lives were the stakes, creed the dealer, and health the wager. The logic of political denial is simple. As long as the populace remains unaware of the plague's existence, panic will not arise. Without panic, ships continue to load cargo. Trains keep departing. Capital flows uninterrupted. This is indeed a pragmatic philosophy, yet it exacts a horrifying moral price for the truth, just as the plague itself always manifests in the most painful and convenient ways. In these murky waters of political denial and deceit, when the public health system was finally compelled to act, its response was tragically stained by deep-seated racial prejudice. The Chinatown community, this city within a city, vibrant, densely populated, this community steeped in exotic mystery, had long been demonized by decades of anti-Chinese legislations and a phobic rhetoric, serving as the perfect scapegoat to defend America's racial and cultural purity. When the plague raged, Chinatown bore the brunt and became the primary, almost exclusive target of brutal isolation measures. This outbreak was not treated as a city-wide public health crisis, but defined as an oriental disease originating from foreign lands, a threat to racial and cultural purity. Chinatown became the primary and almost exclusive target of brutal isolation measures. The plague was deemed a Chinese disease confined to this for an enclave, rather than a public health crisis affecting the entire city. Streets once lined with pharmacies, bustling with restaurants, and echoing with the clamor of theaters, were transformed overnight into a vast, besieged encampment. A sanitary cordon, a term laden with war imagery, encircled the community, with police guarded barriers erected at all exits. Any Chinese resident leaving the area was subjected to inspection, and in most cases, forcibly injected with an experimental serum mistakenly believed to offer protection. Authorities claimed these measures aimed to contain the epidemic, but for the Chinese community, it amounted to an open minus air prison, blatant humiliation and segregation. The health inspections were brutal and degrading. Inspection teams, often accompanied by police, would force their way into homes, shops and basements, searching people's bodies for pustules or other signs of illness. These searches frequently devolved into disguised looting. Property was destroyed under the pretext of disinfection. In the name of disease prevention, Chinatown's streets were sprayed with powerful disinfectants. The air thickened with the acrid stench of lime and chemicals. Homes were cleaned without owners' consent, often leaving behind scenes of devastation, shattered belongings and missing personal items. The scale of these operations was not aimed at eradicating disease citywide, but at marking and controlling specific ethnic groups. Chinese immigrants were not regarded as affected citizens, but as biological carriers, an internal threat requiring containment rather than cure. Disease became a weapon, serving as a pretext to intensify discrimination and oppression. Chinese children were barred from school. Businesses collapsed. Families lived in constant dread, ever minus present the threat of forced inspections or deportation to quarantine hospitals. These institutions offered not only abysmal medical care, but also trampled upon patients' dignity. Yet the Chinese community did not resign itself to this fate. They mounted an admirable, organized resistance. Through guild and civil rights organizations, community leaders took California to court. The Shung v. Williams case became a legal milestone, challenging segregation policies and unjust practices. Despite attempts by Governor Gage and his allies to circumvent federal rulings, federal courts repeatedly upheld the civil rights of Chinese citizens, declaring segregation measures targeting only Chinese people unconstitutional. While this legal victory failed to eradicate xenophobia, it set clear boundaries for the state government's manifestly unfair actions, forcing authorities to extend sanitation measures beyond Chinatown. Though shadows of racial suspicion lingered, San Francisco's plague episode thus became a dark mirror, reflecting not only a public health crisis, but revealing America when the steamship Nippon Maru entered San Francisco harbor in early March 1900. The entire city teetered between an island whispered fear. The air carried not only sea mist, but also an atmosphere of mounting tension born of truths left unsaid. The federal government in Washington, D.C., had been watching California's anxious dance, with persistent rumors crossing the Pacific. From Hong Kong and Honolulu, they could bear no more uncertainty, nor tolerate further diplomatic niceties. Thus, like a surgeon preparing instruments for precision surgery, it was decided that science should take over where politics had failed. The Naval Hospital Service, the precursor to the U.S. Public Health Service, dispatched its most capable and most stubborn figure, Dr. Zhou J. Qinhuai. This renowned bacteriologist possessed a sharp intellect and a near-minus quixotic tenacity. Qinhuai was not one to be intimidated by politicians or commercial interests. He came solely to uncover the truth beneath the microscope, and that truth revealed itself upon arrival. The city, Dr. Kingsville observed, boasted prosperity and unparalleled beauty by daylight, yet concealed within its shadows the filth and neglect inherent to any growing metropolis. His first stop was inevitably Chinatown. Rumors had swirled for months that disease had taken root in the labyrinthine alleys and damp cellars. Local officials, led by Governor Henry Gage, insisted there was nothing to investigate, merely sensationalist hoaxes stirred up by yellow journalism, admittedly tinged with unjust racial fears. But Kim Yang paid no heed to the politics of fear and greed. He plunged immediately into work. The corpses the Chinese community driven by superstition and fear of discrimination, had tried to conceal, became the most compelling evidence. Ultimately, it was the remains of Chinese laborer Huang Shujin that revealed the truth. In the makeshift laboratory, through meticulous dissection and microscopic examination, Kim Yang confirmed Yersinia pestis from samples of swollen, painful bubonic lymph nodes. The plague had not merely arrived, but had taken root and spread. The diagnosis was irrefutable. The third form of the Black Death had manifested in San Francisco. Dr. Kim Yang's confirmatory report drew no gratitude, nor prompted essential action. Instead, it detonated like a bomb at a shareholders' meeting. Predictable fury and more vehement denial followed swiftly. California Governor Gage, allied with the powerful California Promotion Committee representing urban commercial interests, launched an offensive. They accused Dr. Kim Yang of incompetence, racial discrimination, defamation, and leveled the most lethal accusation against any thriving city undermining California. His scientific report, this called brutal truth, was denounced as false and malicious, manipulated by political machinery and money. Local newspapers published editorials portraying Kim Yang as a federal bureaucrat meddling in municipal affairs, seeking personal fame at the expense of the city's prosperity. Dr. Kim stood alone in his laboratory, facing an alliance of powerful politicians, greedy merchants, and a public poisoned by misinformation. The measures he proposed were basic sanitation steps proven effective in other epidemics: strict quarantine of infected zones, fumigation of suspected infected dwellings, comprehensive rat extermination, though the connection between rodents and the epidemic was not yet fully understood. It was beginning to be suspected. Each recommendation met resistance. Every attempt to implement science-based public health measures was politically obstructed. Quarantine was denounced as unjust and harmful. Fumigation was dismissed as unnecessary and prohibitively expensive. Jin Nei gradually became an outcast, a plague doctor no one would listen to. His research findings were banned from publication. Funding was cut off. He was even stripped of access to research areas. This desperate struggle between the scientist and the fortress of willful ignorance and greed ultimately ended due to political infighting and unbearable pressure. 1901, the Naval Hospital Administration personally removed Dr. Kim Yang from San Francisco. This decision, though understandable given political pressures, left the city exposed to the rampant plague. Local elites still refused to acknowledge the plague's existence. Yet the plague obeys no command or commercial interest. It spreads silently and methodically. Dr. Kimmel's departure marked the beginning of official denial, but the plague did not cease. It smoldered like subterranean fire, even as truth was deliberately suppressed beneath a thick blanket of enforced optimism. His departure signaled the start of official denial, yet the plague showed no sign of abating. This disease spread like an underground wildfire, even as authorities strained to mask the epidemic with imposed optimism. Yet truth would eventually see the light of day. Cases continued to appear sporadically, backed by threats of nationwide quarantine. The federal government finally crushed local resistance in 1903, with the new governor more willing to face reality. San Francisco began preparing for a sanitary war. This war commenced in the shadowy basements of filthy alleyways. And unfolded beneath the microscope. Dr. Rupert Brew of the Naval Medical Service was once again entrusted with command. The situation had changed. The plague's threat could no longer be utterly ignored. The strategy was grounded in deeper, though still imperfect, understanding of bacteriology and epidemiology. Paul Lewis Simon's pioneering research in India had revealed the pivotal role of fleas as vectors for disease transmission. This new discovery proved to be BRU's most potent weapon. The war targeted not merely the bacillus, but its carriers. An unprecedented mass rat extermination campaign commenced. This was no task for the faint-hearted or squeamish. The entire city mobilized to set traps. Thousands of rat traps were deployed across port warehouses. And, of course, Chinatown. A bounty was offered for every rat captured, thus spawning a bizarre economy of rat carcasses. Rat catchers suddenly flooded the streets, armed with nets and poisoned bait, their footsteps echoing across the flagstones as they pursued the small invaders. Yet extermination alone was insufficient. People knew that to win this war, the enemy's lair must be destroyed. Operation Rat Eradication commenced immediately. Behind this clinical sounding term lay brutal methods, the systematic demolition of unsanitary buildings, especially those with earthen walled cellars. Rotting roofs and fabric must be utterly destroyed. Rat proofing works began at once. Behind this seemingly dispassionate term lay brutal practice, the systematic demolition of unsanitary structures, especially those harboring muddy cellars. Rotten roofs and riddled walls, veritable rat paradises. New buildings must employ concrete foundations, sealed pipework, and the complete removal of all accessible food sources. This constituted a compulsory urban renewal program. Large scale demolition reshaped the cityscape. Buildings in historic districts like Chinatown faced rigorous inspection. Structures deemed severely infested or unsanitary were forcibly demolished or renovated. This naturally provoked fierce protests from affected communities. They watched helplessly as homes and shops were reduced to rubble under the charge of invisible disease. The rat extermination campaign involved powerful fumigation measures. Port vessels, warehouses, residences and sewers were all fumigated with sulfur. At times, lethal hydrogen cyanide was employed. This highly toxic gas required professional handling and complete evacuation of the area. Fumigation teams moved through the city like specters, leaving behind desolation and the lingering scent of chemicals. Meanwhile, the bacteriological laboratory painstakingly established by Jin Yang became the intellectual nerve center of this city's pandemic response. Doctors and scientists worked ceaselessly day and night analyzing human and rodent tissue samples, tracking the trail of Yersinia pestis. Every confirmed case, every infected rodent became a marked point on the epidemic map, guiding the deployment of extermination operations. Public education became another front, perhaps the most arduous battlefield. After years of official denial, convincing the populace of the plague's reality and its transmission routes proved a monumental task. That such a minute insect as the flea could become a harbinger of death was a concept many found absurd and laughable. The messenger of death still seemed preposterous to many, yet pamphlets were distributed, lectures continued, and newspapers grew more willing to disseminate information. The populace was taught the importance of hygiene, proper waste disposal, and the essentials of rodent control. This shift in public awareness, though slow, proved crucial. The scale of this sanitation campaign was staggering. A complex logistical operation involving hundreds, from physicians and scientists to rat catchers, demolition crews. San Francisco was purging itself with brutal efficiency and unsettling effectiveness, hunting down the hidden enemy in desperation, advancing inch by inch, healing itself through the extermination of rodents. Yet fate always holds dramatic and cruel twists in store. Just as San Francisco began to sense the plague's retreat, and large scale rat extermination and sanitation efforts showed initial success, the earth roared at 5:12 a.m. On 18 April 1906, the subterranean beast awoke. The San Francisco earthquake was no ordinary tremor, lasting less than a minute, it reshaping the city's geography and destiny. Timber miners framed buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets split open into chasms that swallowed everything. More deadly still were the infernos ignited by ruptured gas mains. Before the aftershocks had subsided, Fires consumed the structures left standing. Days of burning reduced the city's heart, newly sprouting with hope, to scorched earth. The scale of destruction was unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless, wandering streets blanketed in rubble, taking shelter in parks and makeshift camps. From the lifeline water mains to communication lines, hospital facilities, urban infrastructure utterly shattered. Amidst this apocalyptic catastrophe, the meticulously coordinated, under-resourced, intensive epidemic containment effort abruptly halted. Sample analysis laboratories destroyed or paralyzed. Rodent control teams scattered and disbanded. From critical firefighting water mains to communication lines and hospital facilities, not a single one spared. Amidst this apocalyptic chaos, the pandemic response, demanding meticulous coordination and vast resources, suddenly ground to a halt. Sample analysis laboratories were utterly destroyed or rendered inoperable. Rodent control teams scattered. Attention shifted to the immediate struggle for survival. Yet the most insidious consequence of this catastrophe, from a public health perspective, lies in its impact on rodent populations. Earthquakes and conflagrations devastated their dark, damp habitats in sewer corners, old building basements, and docks. Internal organs shattered as their shelters crumbled to rubble. Uncustomary food routes were buried beneath debris and ash. Thus, driven by primal survival instinct, the rats fled, forced onto the surface, mingling with desperate crowds, also seeking refuge. They congregated in tent camps, temporary food piles, rubbish dumps, parks, and any place offering sustenance or shelter. This forced migration proved the catalyst for an epidemiological catastrophe. Countless rats already infected with bubonic plague carried disease-ridden fleas directly into vulnerable human populations. Contact between vectors and human host surged dramatically. This biological explosion, triggered by geological catastrophe, unleashed a second, more ferocious wave of plague upon San Francisco after the initial outbreak seemed to subside, particularly from late 1907 through 1908. The marked increase in human bubonic plague cases was undeniable. Under the dual impact of widespread destruction and rodent migration, the plague ravaged San Francisco anew. At the very moment it seemed to recede, San Francisco faced an even more violent second outbreak. This epidemic was marked by a startling increase in human bubonic plague cases, particularly between late 1907 and 1908. Its existence was undeniable. Mass destruction and subsequent rodent migration provided the perfect breeding ground for the plague's resurgence. Amidst the city's reconstruction from ruins, this plague returned in a new guise, testing both human resilience and pushing public health systems to their limits. The earthquake's ashes not only blanketed the land, but also concealed latent threats, ultimately demanding a fresh toll of blood. When the dust of the 1906 earthquake had scarcely settled, amidst San Francisco's scorched ruins, the city paradoxically faced a second encounter with plague. That silent, microscopic foe left no room for denial, no space for political maneuvering, or the selfish short-sightedness of certain local leaders. A decade earlier, it was they who chose to ignore the shadow of spreading disease. The shadow of the plague grew ever darker, though the city lay in ruins. This canvas, erased by fire and earth's fury, buried within its destruction the seeds of unprecedented sanitary reform, the unity forged by catastrophe, under the resolute and systematic leadership of Dr. Rupert Brewer, would finally confront the plague with the gravity it deserved. The sharp-eyed, unwavering Dr. Brewer had long understood the plague's brutal nature. When the epidemic first struck at the turn of the century, he had witnessed it firsthand. Federal warnings were repeatedly thwarted by local resistance, but the earthquake changed everything. San Francisco, its infrastructure already precarious, became a breeding ground for rodents. Now collapsed sewers, piled high with rubble, and thousands of displaced persons sheltering in makeshift camps provided the perfect breeding ground for rodents and their deadly parasites, the fleas. It resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno or a Gothic horror film. Yet for Brew, it was a tragic yet precious opportunity for a fresh start. San Francisco's Victorian buildings, once harboring hidden rodent infestations, were now gone. The black rats' hiding places vanished along with them. This response was no longer a hesitant squabble over jurisdiction. It was a massive coordinated effort, a symphony of muscle and intellect, advancing towards a single goal. The federal government, through the Public Health and Marine Hospital Service, precursor to the U.S. Public Health Service, later evolving into the CDC, gained the legitimate justification and absolute authority to act. Elevated to Director of Operations, Dr. Brew led this campaign. Its scale and rigor rendered it a landmark in public health history. This was no war of gunfire and thunder. It was a silent campaign against an invisible foe. They fought with rat traps, poison bait, and near-minus military discipline. Consider the scale of this campaign. The entire city reduced to scorched earth and rubble. From the ruins emerged an army of men and women fighting relentlessly. They not only rebuilt their homes, but resolved to eradicate every last brick and tile harboring vermin. For the entire city lay in scorched earth and rubble. Amidst the ruins surged legions of men and women laboring day and night. They not only rebuilt their homes, but vowed to eliminate the plague lurking in every crevice. A bounty system emerged. Each captured specimen earned a reward. In makeshift laboratories, every rodent underwent rigorous quarantine. Tens of thousands of rodents are captured daily and transported to inspection stations. This eerie procession reveals the enemy's omnipresent plague imprint. The figures are staggering. Over 100,000 rodents captured and quarantined in a single month. Should an infected rodent be discovered, surrounding areas immediately activate quarantine and disinfection protocols, forming a sanitary cordon that dynamically expands and contracts with the epidemic. Rebuilding is not merely a brick-laying endeavor, but a rebirth shaped by the plague's demands. Engineers and urban planners collaborated with public health experts to establish revolutionary new sanitation standards. Building foundations were fortified against road intrusion. Walls and floors were fully sealed, eliminating nesting sites. Sewer systems were redesigned. Waste management protocols were optimized. Food storage in shops and homes was strictly regulated. Every new structure became an anti-rodent fortress. This public-private pandemic response amounted to a comprehensive militarized deployment, involving not only the health authorities, but also the military, volunteers, charitable organizations, and citizens weary of death's specter. All understood cooperation was essential for survival. Ships and warehouses underwent thorough fumigation. Docks, cellars, and every dark corner where rodents might lurk were systematically purged. Public health inspectors, lanterns in hand, and with iron resolve, scouring every home, every shop, every dustbin. This was far from pleasant work, but absolutely imperative. The plague knows no class or race. It is a cruel equalizer, uniting rich and poor against a common foe. Dr. Land's plan gradually bore fruit. Human plague cases first dwindled, then became sporadic, until they vanished entirely. The second victory won for San Francisco was not won by cannon, but by rat traps, poison, and a public health campaign that fundamentally reshaped the city. The plan bore initial fruit. Human infections plummeted, became sporadic, and vanished entirely. The second battle fought for San Francisco was not won by artillery, but by traps, poison, and an epic public health initiative that rebuilt the city from its foundations. Though the journey was arduous, the lessons endured. San Francisco not only rose from the ashes, but emerged cleaner and safer. Its sanitation infrastructure marked a watershed in American history. The lessons of this bay and San Francisco's harrowing experience reverberated far beyond the hills of the Fog City. From initial denial to ultimate collective response, this crisis transformed America's public health system. Its reverberations still quietly permeate our institutions and laws. Before the San Francisco outbreak, federal public health agencies were treated like poor relations. Their voice in local affairs was feeble. Their authority was routinely questioned. Budgets were stretched thin. Disease was largely seen as a local matter, handled by towns and state governments. Yet the plague's eruption starkly revealed this approach was dangerously fragile when facing a pandemic. But the plague, particularly San Francisco's pandemic response, established crucial legal precedents. Federal actions, spearheaded by BU, became impossible to ignore. The central government not only demonstrated intervention capabilities, but also highlighted the necessity of addressing health crises with cross-state transmission. Interstate quarantine laws were strengthened, establishing the principle that community health is inextricably linked to national health. Their health is intrinsically connected. This was not arbitrary interference, but a necessary safeguard for trade flow and public security. The plague cruelly exposed the flaws of an excessively decentralized public health system and the shortcomings of federalism. Beyond legal reforms, the pandemic response spurred the modernization of urban sanitation infrastructure and its nationwide adoption. San Francisco became a model through its innovative rodent-proof building codes, improved sewer systems, and smarter waste management solutions. Other cities began evaluating the infrastructure with fresh perspective. People gradually recognized that public health is not merely about treating and saving lives, but fundamentally about eradicating the sources of disease. This necessitates investment in cleaner, safer environments. Local health departments, long constrained by scarce resources and limited authority, began to gain greater weight. Funding and specialist personnel. Epidemiology, the discipline studying disease transmission mechanisms, transformed from a niche field into a critical tool. Through meticulous data collection on rodents, risk zones were pinpointed, and deciphering the role of fleas as vectors. The scientific understanding achieved a major breakthrough. The lessons from this epidemics cemented the modern epidemiological framework, where science and data supplanted outdated theories and moralistic explanations. They became the pillars for future pandemic responses. San Francisco served as a great laboratory for this transformation in many respects. The plague not only claimed thousands of lives and terrified millions, but also became an unintended catalyst for the emergence of a stronger and more centralized public health system in the United States. It left a legacy of legislation, infrastructure, and mindset, revealing how individual and community health intertwine with urban environments and trade networks. The rat traps on San Francisco streets symbolically captured the foundation laid for federal health crisis response, from the 1918 influenza to contemporary pandemic. Though a harsh teacher, its lessons are etched into the city's concrete and hospital laboratory protocols, rather than parchment scrolls. Despite San Francisco's triumph and its drive for public health modernization, the plague's shadow never fully receded. This eerie characteristic of historical pandemic, an almost eerie resonance, they are seldom eradicated entirely, merely lying dormant, mutating, seeking new ecological niches. The third pandemic was no exception. Though the World Health Organization declared the epidemic over in 1959, marking the end of a global outbreak and death cycle that began in Hong Kong and persisted for nearly 60-5 years. This by no means signified the extinction of Yersinia pestis. Eradicating plague is no simple matter, especially when it resides in wildlife. the true story of the plague, in its most enduring, silent form. It now lurks within the vast wilderness of the American West. Wild rodents, those silent dwellers of grasslands and mountains, marmots, prairie dot, ground squirrels, and even certain rabbit species, serve as natural hosts for Yersinia pestis. Scientists term this forest plague. This disease circulates silently among animal population, following its own cycles and rhythms, largely beyond human sight and memory. Yersinia pestis, this ancient perpetual motion machine, this wanderer, has carved out new territory here, a new host continent where it can become endemic. How did it arrive? This often minus forgotten journey is particularly compelling. After plague minus scaring rodents reached West Coast ports like San Francisco, they did not merely linger in Chinatown or the dock. Over time, by rail transport, unwitting travelers, unnatural dispersal, some rodents or their flea minus-borne pathogens encountered inland wild rodent populations, Arizona prairie dogs, California ground squirrels, Colorado marmots, all became potential hosts. Their subtle ecological shift left scarcely a trace, yet produced enduring consequences. Plague has become naturalist in the Americas, from urban rodents and human disease to becoming part of the wild rodent ecosystem. To this day, Yersinia pestis persists in the American West, like a biological relic of past pandemics. These regions occasionally see extremely rare human cases of bubonic plague, typically linked to contact with infected wildlife or their fleas, such as dogs scavenging dead rodents, or hikers camping in endemic areas. These cases serve as a shadow minus-like reminder though the global pandemic has ended, the pathogen still lurks in the shadows waiting for its chance. Thanks to improved sanitation and medical advances, it no longer poses a major public health threat in developed nations. Yet it remains a constant warning that humanity can never fully conquer nature. The third plague pandemic thus leaves a multifaceted legacy. It deepens our understanding of the connection between ecology and disease, that the health of prairie rodents could so cruelly impact an entire city's well-being. It awakened our awareness of the devastating power of global trade and travel. A single ship carrying rodents at an ocean port could unleash plague on the other side of the globe. Most crucially, it left an eternal warning about humanity's own existence. It warns us of the devastating power of global trade and travel. A single ship carrying rodents at an ocean port can unleash a plague on the other side of the world. Most crucially, it serves as a profound testament to humanity's own fragility and the necessity of perpetual vigilance. Fragility and the imperative of eternal vigilance. Yersinia pestis. This minuscule bacterium that devastated human communities for centuries did not vanish in 1959. It merely retreated into the wilderness, peering silently from rodent burrows. This living warning declares, even in modern times, biology's past never truly vanishes. It merely, and this is the truly unsettling truth, lies dormant, perhaps like us, awaiting the next dawn, or the next moment of carelessness. At this moment, bearing these tales, perhaps, merely perhaps, your soul shall find the peace it deserves.